Hi, this is lecture 16, must be about chapter 14, the US presidency. As you know, the US Constitution has given separate powers to the executive and legislative and judicial branches. Congress is the one that has the power of the disbursement of funds. It controls the money. The Congress is the one that can spend the US Treasury money. The White House cannot do that. It's all authorized, dispensed by the US Congress. That's how the founders wanted it to be. The president, in that regard, can only go along by what the Congress sees in terms how much money goes to which program and for how long. The US Congress is the one that authorizes war, declares wars, as we said before. There is a certain majesty to the power of the US presidency. As you know, there was discussion about George Washington becoming king, and some people wanted that, and they were royalists on the part of the revolutionaries. George Washington did not want that, and in fact, to his credit, he stepped down from office after 2 terms. He could have served for life if he wanted, but he didn't. And in fact, there was no constitutional prohibition from a president being elected and re-elected thrice or 4 or 5 times. But since Washington only served 2 terms only, no president after him dared to serve for more, except FDR. And that's why the 22nd Amendment was passed in order to curtail the appetite of presidents everywhere in the world to serve for a longer period of time. The president represents and embodies the United States. He is the image of the United States around the world. There was an agreement about the majesty of the presidency, but now it has become much more contentious. I mean, there are some people who did not accept George W. Bush as their president, just as there are people who did not accept Obama as their president, and there were arguments that Obama was not born in the United States. Of course, he was born here. And there were people who believed that George W. Bush did not win the presidency, which he, of course, won. It's a very powerful office. The founders wanted energy in the office. They wanted to give it powers beyond what is listed in the Constitution. Qualifications are quite simple. Natural born citizen, at least 35 years old, who had lived in the US for at least 14 years. Natural born citizen meaning that he is somebody who did not attain citizenship while, during his lifetime, that he was born an American citizen and who had lived for 14 years. FDR was the first president to serve for more than 2 terms, and then after him, a 22nd Amendment was passed prohibiting the president from serving for a 3rd term. 4 presidents did not win let me fix that. Did not win the popular vote, but won the Electoral College. The last one was George W. Bush in 2000. He lost the popular vote by 500,000 votes, and he won by Electoral College. And some people believe that he cheated because he did not win the popular vote. But the Constitution does not say a president is somebody who needs to win the popular vote. It goes by Electoral College, and he won. And of course, there was a whole controversy about recount in Florida, but even when the recount was done, George W. Bush won Florida. The office of president keeps evolving because the Constitution wasn't clear on what role the president should have, how big is his influence within the US government. And there is a distinction made by constitutional scholars between the express powers of president versus delegated powers of the president. Expressed powers of the president are those that are explicitly stated in the Constitution. Like, for example, it's very clear he is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. So the U.S. is on the top of the military hierarchy. Of course, no president ever donned the military uniform, even though some of them were generals like President Eisenhower. But they did not want to confuse the distinction between civilian rule and military rule, which has happened in many other countries. We've never had any military rule here in the United States. And the respect for the civilian control of the military has been exemplified by the fact that presidents do not wear a military uniform. Even the Surgeon General of the United States has a military uniform, and he or she wears it, but the president do not wear their military uniform. So these are the expressed powers of the president versus delegated powers, meaning these are powers that Congress may extend on a president during crisis or wartime or civil war. I mean, President Lincoln amassed to himself so many extraordinary powers during the Civil War, and Congress went along with that. In theory, the executive branch, I mean, in theory and in practice, the executive branch implements the laws of the legislature. That's what we talk about, the executive branch and the legislative branch. Inherent powers of the president, this is the third category of powers, are those that are implied. The executive power, this is Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive power shall be vested in a president. Executive power shall be vested in a president. What does that mean? How is that expressed? It's not very clear. It's not very clear. But this article, this vague formulation, has served at a time of crisis for the president to take strong initiative and to rule more than usually, more than usual because of his need historically to play a very decisive role against enemies, foreign or domestic. There has been a notion since American historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He talked about the imperial presidency. You see, the president has increased in power. The power of the president in the 20th century has really expanded. And this certainly has been the case since FDR. You have to understand that. We discussed what is liberal, what's conservative. And after the Great Depression of 1929, imagine, when you think about unemployment, when we had the recession in 2007, 2008, and 9, unemployment was very high at 12, 13%, right, here in California. Imagine in 1929, the unemployment was 25%. So FDR felt, rightly or wrongly, that the president should take a very decisive role and to increase government's intervention in the economy. This expanded the role of the president. So the notion of an imperial presidency characterizes the newly revised and improved powers of the president in the 20th century, while the president has become quite powerful, and especially at times when the president has Congress within the same party. You understand? FDR enjoyed that. That's tremendous advantage for the president, and that allows the president to make initiative and does whatever he wishes. At one point, FDR was told that some Supreme Court justices were not going to go along with him, and he was like, well, we'll impeach them and remove them from office. That's the extent to which this was the intelligent amendment, the 22nd Amendment, that prevented any extension of the term of the president beyond the 2 terms. Because FDR, serving in office that long, he started to think that he was invincible, that he can do anything he wanted. He lost sight of the respect for divisions of power within the U.S. government. The dual presidency refers to, this is a notion by Aaron Wildovsky, who was professor at UC Berkeley, who's now dead. And he talked about the dual presidency. What he meant by that is we have 2 presidents. We have the domestic policy president and we have the foreign policy president. The domestic policy president is a very weak president. The foreign policy president is majestic and imperial. What we mean by that is, on domestic policy, the president, as you saw from the healthcare debate, cannot do much. She has to go against the American public if they don't agree with him, and against Congress if they don't agree with him, and push certain proposals. You see, on domestic policy, all of you have strong formed opinions. You know exactly what you think about taxes, abortion, death penalty, drugs, education, prayer in school. All these issues you feel very strongly about. Taxes. As a result, the president has to deal with strongly held opinion among the domestic constituency. So as a result, the navigation is very tough. You see, very tough. On foreign policy, however, the public doesn't have strong views. your views are very malleable, not very solidly formulated. As a result, the president does what he or she wants. And this created a very imperial role for the presidency in the 20th century, in times of war or times of peace. I mean, look at the war on drugs. I mean, when does it end? How big is it? When do we declare an end to that war? Or the war on, the war on terrorism, the war, so the wars have allowed the president to have tremendous powers. I mean, look at the President Obama, for example, with the issue of drones. I mean, the president, we have this penalty in the United States, but it goes through a legal process. People have to go through the legal system, go through trial, through appeals, and then they can put in death row, and then execution comes. It is permitted. But now we have new rules. The president in the war on terrorism is now capable of ordering the killing of an American citizen anywhere in the world if the intelligence agencies believe that that person is a terrorist. But it doesn't go through a legal process. The president can sign on to kill an American citizen. I don't think the founders conceived that role of a president. That's extremely strong. And I believe this is going to eventually come under Supreme Court review, because it's quite unprecedented that this is the power of the president today, to order drones to kill American citizens overseas. It doesn't happen here, of course, and the thing is, like, all the ones against whom the drones have been targeted have been Americans of a Muslim faith. But I imagine if sometimes, by mistake or by design, some American who is not a Muslim, who is targeted by a drone, that could lead to a more strong reaction, I would imagine. So this is going to be debated, I think. The commander-in-chief role is very important. Congress has allowed the president to exercise supreme roles as commander-in-chief. He or she can do in terms of military intervention around the world. I mentioned to you before that we've only had 5 declared wars by Congress, and all the rest, more than 160 military intervention worldwide, and they have been done by the president without. I shouldn't have that sound because I turned everything off. And that happened by virtue of the power of the president. The president can authorize troops to be deployed overseas. And this has expanded so much. Like in the Korean War, it wasn't a war. It was called a police action. And during the Vietnam War, when we had over 100,000 troops there, it was referred to as military advisors. Military advisors. So with that expansion under Republican and Democratic presidents, Congress in 1973 decided to take up a new law called War Powers Act of 1973. According to that law, it says a president may not deploy troops overseas without the expressed consent of Congress, and that a president can deploy troops, but only up to 60 days. Beyond the 60 days, he or she has to have the approval of Congress. How has that worked in 1973? Did Congress really assert itself? The answer is no. Because you see, whenever the president deploys troops anywhere, and then the 60 days pass, who in Congress dares to not authorize the president to get more money to cover the expenditure for the troops? Can you imagine the outcry if you're running for office, for re-election anywhere in this country, and your opponent in a debate will say, and he or she did not support the troops in war? That would be such a killer in an election. So for the reason of public opinion and support for the military, Congress hasn't really exercised its role strongly, has not intervened to implement the War Powers Act effectively. The president can really now go to war anywhere he wants or she wants without much complaints from Congress, because of the fear on the part of Congress of coming across as not supporting fully U.S. troops. I was going to say something about the same thing with the intelligence communities. We now know under the Bush administration, the government, the executive branch, was able to open secret prisons. The CIA opened secret prisons in Poland and elsewhere, and there was torture, violation of American laws that took place in those secret prisons, and Congress did not know about it. And There's always been this tug of war, how much Congress should know. And the intelligence agency which serve under the president, we have more than 16, 17 intelligence agencies, usually are circumspect about sharing information with Congress because they don't trust Congress, because Congress, and that's true, leaks to the press. But on the other hand, the Constitution, there has to be an oversight power of Congress. Congress authorizes the money for all these agencies, and they should know how the money is being spent. The president is also the top diplomat. You have to understand, we have more than 105 embassies and consulates around the world. The United States has official relationship in more than 200 countries of the world. Even in enemy countries, we also have secret CIA stations. Just like we have embassies in every country in the world, without exception, we have CIA stations, meaning the US intelligence agencies operate secret bases from different countries of the world in order to engage in covert operations on behalf of the US government. The president knows about all that. The president, every day in the morning, the first action of any president in recent years is to start his or her day by an intelligence briefing about what happened in the world in the last 24 hours. And much of that reportage comes from the report of CIA stations around the world. So the president is the top diplomat. He is the face of America in talks to other countries. After Eisenhower, we see the president's role increased, and even though it is the Congress that has the legislative role, presidents today now have legislative agendas. They set out to say, I want these laws to be passed. And you can think about it as, this is not what the Constitution invention. Legislation is the work of Congress. Why is a president doing that? Well, in the State of the Union, and that's something that is in the Constitution, that a president, it doesn't say every year, has to address Congress and to speak about the state of the nation. But now that ritual has changed in nature. Every year now, a president makes a speech to Congress in which he or she sets out their legislative agenda. That these are the kind of laws that I want Congress to pass. When Congress was on the side of the president, you can have support, but when Congress today is under the Republican rule, both houses, then it becomes very difficult. How is the president going to do that? And there is in the White House a special liaison, special person who, in an office which works with Congress to advance the legislative agenda of the president. I mean, look at the presidential contest that we have now. I mean, both candidates, or more if you want to add the Libertarians, the Greens, and others, presidential candidates Hillary and Trump are talking about what they want to do. These laws want to change, lower taxes, higher taxes. I mean, this is legislation. The president is not supposed to be in charge of legislation. That's the work of Congress. So basically what they are doing is trying to convince the public that they will have all that accomplished. Many presidents can't accomplish that because Congress decides what laws will be passed. A president has a role in legislation in that he or she can veto or reject any legislation passed by Congress. And Congress can only overturn the veto by a two-thirds majority, which is a very high bar, very difficult to achieve. The president is also head of a huge, humongous bureaucracy. There are 15 departments of government and 2 million civil servants. These are the people who work in the U.S. agencies and administrations throughout the country. We have different departments of government: Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Commerce, Department of the Interior, Department of Homeland Security. We have the National Intelligence Center. We have Department of, what did I miss? Commerce, Agriculture, Secretary of Transportation. I mean, so we have all these departments, and this is part, all of the president heads this big government bureaucracy. The president, unbeknownst to many Americans, can also make laws in specific cases. He has the power, or she has the power, to make what is called executive orders. That means guidelines for federal agencies. Guidelines for federal agency. Supposedly, the president can basically say, I want the federal agency to do this or that, but that can be close to a law. Like the president can authorize or reinterpret the law to mean that we can now have torture or we can now kill citizens in foreign countries and so on and so forth. So that's a strong role by the president. After the Great Depression, the president has become also in charge of a smooth running of the economy. The president is in charge of a bureaucracy to guide the economy in a safe way. Of course, that doesn't always succeed because the economy is not always under the president's control. The president is also the head of the state, meaning the president is the official head of the state. Like, for example, in England, they have the Queen. The president here, but she's ceremonial. The president is head of the executive branch, which is a very powerful position, but he or she is also head of the state. He or she embodies the representation of the state in the world. The president is also the head of his or her own party. Each president belongs to a party, and if Hillary wins, she becomes the head of the Democratic Party. If Trump wins, he will become the head of the Republican Party. Theodore Roosevelt spoke also of another role of a president, what is called the bully pulpit, which means the president has a great advantage in speaking to the nation, that he or she has the ability to persuade, the power to persuade, the power to change minds. I mean, if you and I make a speech, even if we buy time on TV, it's not the same. But when a president makes a speech, it can make a difference. For whatever reasons, Americans find a president to be persuasive, that he or she has the knowledge and the power to make authoritative statements. And FDR, for example, used the bully pulpit to convince Americans, especially skeptical Americans, that we need to be involved in the Second World War. The president used the media, and they all use the media to their advantage, and you may call that propaganda. They use the media in order to convey messages. For example, many presidents like to give interviews to local TV stations and not to the national network. You know why? Because local TV stations are so excited to be in the presence of the president in the Oval Office that they are so impressed, they are so gushed that they only ask softball questions like, at what time do you go to bed? What is your favorite dish? Do you munch at night? These kind of questions. And they really ask these questions, by the way. And for that reason, presidents favor the local media as opposed to the national media, which supposedly may ask tougher questions, but they don't really do. Approval rating basically is something that Gallup and all polling firms do in this 20th and 21st century. Every time there's a president, every week or so, they ask people, how much do you approve of the president's whatever he or she is doing? And we measure that. So we find that, and it fluctuates. Sometimes presidents are very unpopular, sometimes they are very popular. Whenever there is war, presidents become very popular. Herbert Walker Bush in 1990 became very popular when he had the war in Iraq. Same for George W. Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush's popularity was 91%. George W. Bush after September 11 became very popular, something like 89% approval rating. People who approved of the job that he's doing. But yet, when George W. Bush left office after 8 years, his approval rating was around 24%, extremely low. President Obama's approval rating have fluctuated. It was very low, and lately it has been going up. In fact, it is now quite high for a president in his second term, because in the second term, people are sick and tired of a president that the approval rating drops. But for some reason, the president remains strong in approval rating. Each president has a different presidential style of governance. The president is a leader, and there are leadership styles. Let me give an example. Some presidents work very hard, and some presidents are just lazy. Some presidents have a lot of patience to read. Some presidents are bored very quickly. You have to be able to know how much attention, how much you manage of the leadership role that you have. I'll give you an example. Ronald Reagan, for example, did not work hard at all. he took long naps. He did not work hard in the job. And in fact, there's a famous story told by Luke Cannon in his book Role of a Lifetime about Ronald Reagan as president. And he really liked Ronald Reagan. It's a very sympathetic biography. And he tells the story. One time, Ronald Reagan had a summit meeting with a Soviet leader, and the Soviet leader ran through the president, made him agree to things that he should not have agreed, because the president was very ill prepared. He did not read his briefing books. Every time there's a meeting, you have to read a certain briefing book prepared by your staff before the meeting. Reagan did not prepare. So the chief of staff, James Baker at the time, came to Reagan and said, please, we arrange now for another summit, but this time before we meet, you have to be prepared. You have to read your briefing books. The time before the summit came, and James Baker the night before gave the president briefing books to prepare. The next day he came to him in the morning. He said, so were you able to prepare? He said, well, I started to prepare, but then we were flipping the TV and we saw Sound of Music. And you know, Sound of Music is, well, it's Sound of Music. By the way, Sound of Music is the first movie I ever saw in a theater. I was 6 years old at the time. And I really liked Julie Andrews. So he wasn't prepared. So Reagan was detached. In fact, he was so detached that Iran-Contra scandal happened, which I don't have time to tell you, but it was blamed on the fact he did not mind his own store. He did not know what his advisors were doing. You should be able to know that. And that's what Harry Truman meant when he put on his desk, the buck stops here, meaning I am ultimately responsible. And to be responsible, you have to do what your underlings are doing. George W. Bush also did not have much patience for memo and preparations. Like, for example, he did not like long briefing books. He wanted memos only to be 1 page long. And the CIA would prepare him briefing using slides and pictures and playing cards. They would put terrorist leaders on playing cards so that he'll be able to follow more closely. So that's one example of being aloof and detached. George W. Bush slept early every night at 9:30 or 10. Jimmy Carter is another extreme. You don't want to be too prepared. Jimmy Carter insisted on reading every memo that passed through the White House. That's not a good style of governance either. Jimmy Carter wanted to read so much as president that he took a course in speed reading. And he used to correct the grammar of the memos that passed through his desk. That's not right. You are a president, and there is so much in the world you have to pay attention to. You cannot afford to waste your time like that. The chief of staff of the White House should make sure you do not do these things. George Herbert Walker Bush paid so much attention to foreign policy, but he was bored with domestic policy, and I think he paid a price for that by not being reelected. Richard Nixon worked very hard as president. I know that he's famous for not that, and Richard Nixon, by the way, was a very qualified president. He knew so much about foreign policy, domestic policy. Of course, he had another side to his personality, which was paranoid and scheming, and he wasted so much time on conspiracies and so on. But he was prepared as president. He knew what's happening in his own government. Obama would, how would I classify Obama? Obama would, Bill Clinton, for example, was totally disorganized. Meetings would go on for hours. He never knew, he was not decisive. He would postpone making decisions. Obama is much more organized. He reads a lot his briefing books every day until 2 in the morning. He barely sleeps. He works hard on the job, but not to the point of Jimmy Carter. So there is a balance. However, he seems to insist on controlling foreign policy by himself. So Hillary Clinton or Secretary of State really do not control the foreign policy. Obama has controlled it. He should have delegated more to the Secretary of State, which he hasn't done. So these are different styles of leadership that I described for you. Too involved versus too aloof. The president's team are the people who work for him, and key in that is the cabinet. The cabinet refers to all these secretaries of state, of defense, and so on. They don't meet regularly. In other countries, cabinet meets every week. In America, they don't meet regularly because the president leaves it to his subordinates or her subordinates to make sure that there is a smooth running of different cabinet and different government agencies. The president doesn't have time to do that. And in fact, sometimes, like in Bill Clinton's administration, second term, the cabinet only met twice. Like one time to tell him, that scandal about this woman, I did not have sex with her. The second time the cabinet met was he summoned them in. He said, you know the time I told you that I didn't have sex with that woman? Well, I did. I mean, it shows you how infrequently. In fact, cabinets are so infrequently meeting in America that one time, Ronald Reagan had one African American member of the cabinet, Secretary Pierce of Transportation. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Housing and Urban Development. And one time there was a function in the White House, and he saw him. He went to him and he said, "Welcome to the White House, Mr. Mayor." He assumed that he was a black mayor of Baltimore at the time, which was quite embarrassing for the president. So the president doesn't meet with them frequently. Of course, a president has an inner cabinet, meaning these key advisors of the president, meaning Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, CIA Director, all these are the key advisors of the president with whom he talks and meets regularly. The president have a meeting with the Secretary of State every week. Every week. He used to have lunch with Hillary Clinton every week. Chief of Staff is the person in charge of the government of the White House bureaucracy, which is in charge of running smoothly the office of the President of the United States, because it has he or she is we've never had a female Chief of Staff, gatekeeper to the President of the White. I mean, you cannot allow anybody to meet the President. Up until the early 20th century, anybody could go to the White House. Anybody. And people used to go there during inauguration time and would steal china and stuff. One time the president couldn't find a place to meet because there were all these people swarming in. That's changed, especially after assassination and security and so on. Nobody can walk into the White House anymore. And the president of the White House has different offices to advise him: Office of Management and Budget, National Security Council, Council of Economic Advisors. There's a huge bureaucracy in the White House, and even in the old executive building across from the White House. These are part of the bureaucracy of the White House itself. Our bureaucracy of the White House has grown tremendously because the function of the government has expanded to a great deal. The first spouse has been a woman in American history, and the thing is, it seems that Americans do not like the first lady, as she is called, to have a very political role because they feel she is not elected. So they like a traditional wifely role for the wife of the president. Now, we may have a woman president for the first time, and for the first time, we'll have the first gentleman. And I wonder if the same rules, sexist rules, that apply to the first ladies will apply to the first gentleman. I wonder about that, but that's another topic. And see you next time. Get out of here.